The war ended on a Tuesday, at least that's what the paper said. For Sergeant Luke Carter, it didn't end at all. When the last convoy rolled out and the base went silent, he thought maybe, just maybe, peace would come with the quiet. But silence has a way of making the wrong things louder. Every night, the sounds came back, the snap of gunfire, the low thud of explosions, the shouts, the static of the radio. He could still feel the weight of the desert heat on his back, smell the burned sand, and see faces that didn't make it home. By the time he landed back in Virginia, the world felt too soft. The air was too still. People smiled too easily. For months, Luke drifted. He'd wake before dawn, out of habit, and sit at the edge of his bed with his hands clasped, waiting for orders that never came. He tried to sleep, but the dreams were like old enemies that knew exactly where to hit. Sometimes, he'd sit in his truck at night, parked by the river, and stare at the moon's reflection on the water. It was the only thing that seemed unchanged. He thought about re-enlisting more than once, not because he missed the fight, but because at least there he knew who he was. Here, he was just another man with a scar on his shoulder and a story he couldn't tell. Then came the ad. He wasn't looking for it, just scrolling through listings for farm equipment on an old laptop when a small photo caught his eye. A farmhouse for rent on the outskirts of town. Old but solid, the listing said. A red barn, a few acres, and a price that didn't make sense. He didn't think twice. A week later, he was there, standing in the long grass, boots sinking into the soft earth. The barn leaned a little to one side, and the paint had peeled down to bare wood in places. But there was something honest about it. No noise, no traffic, just wind, crickets, and the faint smell of hay. He signed the lease that day. For the first time in years, Luke had a place that was his. It wasn't much, just a small one-story house with uneven floors and a leaky roof, but it felt possible. He bought a second-hand tractor, fixed the fence, and spent the next few weeks clearing the overgrown fields. The work was hard, but it made sense. You dig, you lift, you sweat. You sleep a little better that night. Then, one morning, he found the dog. It was late October, the kind of morning that bites at your fingers and smells like wood smoke. Luke was hauling lumber to the barn when he noticed a shape near the treeline. A thin, tan-colored mutt watching him from the brush. The dog didn't move, didn't bark, just stared. "Hey there, buddy," Luke called softly, dropping the lumber and crouching down. "You lost." The dog tilted his head, but didn't come closer. His ribs showed through his coat, and one of his ears hung lower than the other. There was a limp in his right leg. Luke left a piece of bread by the fence and went back to work. When he returned an hour later, the bread was gone. The next morning, the dog was back. It went on like that for days. The dog would appear at a distance, watching him work, and Luke would leave food by the fence. Bits of leftover stew, half a sandwich, whatever he had. Slowly, the gap between them began to close. By the end of the week, the dog had started sleeping in the barn. Luke found him curled up in the hay one night, trembling from the cold. He didn't chase him off. He just placed an old blanket nearby and left the door open. He didn't plan on keeping him. He told himself that a dozen times. He wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, didn't want to get attached. He'd seen what happened when you let yourself care too much. But then, one morning, Luke stepped outside to find the dog sitting on his porch, muddy paws, head tilted, eyes bright and hopeful, like he'd made up his mind. Luke sighed. "You're not gonna leave, are you?" The dog thumped his tail once, slow and certain. "Well," Luke muttered, scratching his chin, "guess every barn needs a guard dog." He poured a bowl of water, rummaged through the pantry for something better than scraps, and set it down. The dog approached carefully, as if testing whether this kindness was real. When he finally ate, Luke felt something shift in his chest. A small, quiet warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He named him Rusty, after the color of the barn doors. Over the next few weeks, Rusty followed Luke everywhere. He'd trot behind him through the fields, nap in the shade while Luke fixed the fence, and sit on the porch at dusk as the sun sank behind the hills. He wasn't a young dog, but he had a patient, loyal kind of energy, the kind that waits without asking. At night, when the nightmares came, Luke would sometimes wake to find Rusty lying beside the bed, chin resting on his boot, just watching, breathing, and somehow that was enough to pull him back from the edge. One evening, Luke sat on the porch steps, watching Rusty chase fireflies across the yard. The air was cool and soft, carrying the faint smell of hay and rain. "You know," he said quietly, "I don't think I found you. I think you found me." Rusty paused, turned toward him, and wagged his tail once. Luke smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that didn't feel like effort. For the first time since the war, he felt something like peace. Not the loud kind, not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that grows slow and quiet, like grass over old wounds. He looked out over the fields, the barn standing steady in the fading light, and felt a strange certainty in his chest. Maybe healing didn't happen all at once. Maybe it started small, one meal shared, one step closer, one tail wag at a time. He leaned back against the porch post and exhaled. The crickets sang their low, steady song. And for the first time in years, Luke Carter didn't feel like a soldier anymore. He just felt home. Winter came early that year. The first frost rolled over the fields like a soft white blanket, and the air turned sharp enough to sting your lungs. Luke had stocked up on firewood and canned goods, and the old farmhouse creaked and sighed against the wind like it was settling into its own kind of sleep. Rusty had grown stronger since the day Luke found him. His ribs no longer showed, his coat had thickened, and the limp in his leg had mostly faded. But every now and then, something in him would change, some sound, some scent, and he'd freeze, tail tucked, eyes darting toward the woods. At first, Luke thought maybe it was a fox or a coyote, but the way Rusty reacted felt different, like fear or memory. One evening, Luke was repairing a loose hinge on the barn door when Rusty suddenly started barking, deep, panicked barks that echoed through the cold air. The dog's fur stood on end, and he bolted toward the far fence, barking into the trees as if shouting at ghosts. "Rusty! Hey, easy boy!" Luke called out, wiping his hands and jogging over. But Rusty didn't stop. He just kept barking, pacing back and forth near a broken section of fence, nose to the ground. Luke followed his gaze into the woods. Nothing. Just the usual tangle of bare branches and shadows. Still, something about it made his skin prickle. He knelt beside Rusty and ran a hand over his back. "It's okay. Whatever it is, it's gone now." Rusty finally quieted, but he didn't take his eyes off the trees. That night, he slept by the door instead of his usual spot beside the bed. The next morning, Luke found tracks near the fence, boot prints, half covered by frost. Not fresh, but not old either. He studied them for a long moment, then looked back toward the barn. Someone had been here. He didn't tell anyone. There wasn't really anyone to tell. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles down the road, an old farmer who mostly kept to himself. So Luke just patched the fence, cleaned his rifle, and went back to work, twitching at every sound. Sometimes he'd wander to the tree-line and stare, quiet and still, as if trying to remember something. That's when Luke started to wonder, where had Rusty come from? The shelter in town had no record of him. The local vet hadn't seen him before either. Just an old dog with no tags, no microchip, no history. Stray, Luke thought. Maybe abandoned, maybe worse, but there were signs that didn't fit. Rusty knew commands, simple ones like sit and stay, but also things Luke hadn't taught him. Once, when Luke dropped a wrench and swore under his breath, Rusty flinched hard, cowering as if bracing for a blow. Another time, when a truck backfired down the road, Rusty dove under the porch, trembling for nearly an hour. Luke had seen that kind of fear before in soldiers. One night, after a long day of mending fences, Luke sat on the porch steps, mug of coffee in hand, and spoke into the dark. "You been through something, haven't you, boy?" Rusty, lying a few feet away, lifted his head. Luke took a slow sip. "Yeah, me too." It wasn't much of a confession, but it felt heavier than it sounded. He thought about the noise, the loss, the faces that never faded. He thought about the way he'd flinched when fireworks went off that 4th of July and how he'd driven until the sound disappeared. Maybe that's what drew them together, not need but understanding. Over the next few weeks, Luke began to notice more of Rusty's strange habits. He'd dig near the barn sometimes, in the same spot over and over. When Luke checked, he found nothing, just dirt and roots. But Rusty kept returning, like he was looking for something he'd lost. Then, one snowy afternoon, while clearing debris behind the barn, Luke's shovel hit something solid. He knelt down, brushed away the snow, and found a piece of metal, a tag. Rusted, bent, half-buried. He wiped it clean and read the faint letters etched on it. Rust, property of Grayridge Farm. Grayridge Farm. The name rang a faint bell, but Luke couldn't place it. He carried the tag inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and looked it up on his old laptop. The first result was a local news story, dated 3 years earlier. Abandoned farm discovered after owner's death, dozens of animals rescued. Luke clicked it open. The photos showed a rundown property not far from his own, maybe 10 miles east. The article said the owner, a reclusive farmer named Henry Dawes, had passed away during the winter, leaving behind neglected livestock and several dogs, most too weak to survive. Only one had run off before rescuers arrived. The article didn't say the dog's name, but Luke didn't need it to. He looked over at Rusty, sleeping by the fire, paws twitching in some silent dream. "You were his, weren't you?" he murmured. "You had a home once." Rusty's ear flicked, but he didn't wake. Luke sat there a long while, the glow of the fire dancing across the walls. The thought of that old farmer dying alone in the cold, his animals starving around him, it hit Luke in a place he didn't expect, because he knew what it felt like to be left behind. The next morning, Luke loaded some supplies into his truck, just a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and an old map, and drove toward where Grayridge Farm was marked. The road narrowed as he went, winding through thick woods and forgotten fields. Eventually, the truck couldn't go any further, so he walked. The air grew colder, heavier. Birds were quiet here. When he reached the clearing, the sight stopped him in his tracks. The farmhouse was half collapsed, roof caved in, windows shattered. The barn leaned precariously, its doors hanging open like a mouth mid-scream. Rusted tools lay scattered in the dirt, and near the barn door, barely visible under snow, was an old wooden sign. Grayridge. Rusty sniffed the air, tail low. His body tensed as they approached. Then, suddenly he pulled forward, whining softly, leading Luke to the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. Broken stalls lined the walls. Old hay crunched beneath their boots. Rusty stopped in the middle of the floor, sniffed once, and sat down, right on the spot where the boards had rotted through. Luke knelt beside him and placed a hand on his back. The dog was trembling. "It's okay, Rusty," he whispered. "You don't have to remember." But he could tell Rusty already did. That night, back home, Luke lit a fire and sat quietly while Rusty lay curled by his feet. There was something different in the air between them now, something deeper, heavier, but also gentler. They were both survivors of different wars. Both had seen too much, lost too much. Luke reached down, scratched Rusty's ear, and said softly, "You made it out, buddy. That's what matters." Rusty looked up at him, eyes reflecting the firelight, and pressed his head against Luke's knee. In that small, wordless moment, Luke understood something he hadn't before. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting where you came from. Maybe it was about finding someone who understood it, and stayed anyway. Snow blanketed the farm in silence. The world outside Luke's window had turned into a canvas of white and stillness, the kind that makes every sound feel sacred. He stood at the window that morning with a mug of coffee in hand, watching as Rusty nosed through the drifts, tail wagging lazily. It had been 3 days since their trip to Grayridge. Rusty seemed lighter now, like something in him had finally settled. But every so often, Luke would catch him staring at the treeline again, ears alert, eyes sharp, as if the woods still whispered something only he could hear. Luke tried not to think about that place too much. The collapsed barn, the quiet fields, the ghost of a life long gone. Still, it clung to his thoughts in a way he couldn't shake. That afternoon, while patching the roof of his own barn, Luke noticed something odd. The air inside felt colder. Not the kind of cold that came from winter drafts, but something heavier, stiller, like stepping into a room where someone had just whispered your name. Rusty followed him inside, cautious as ever. His nails clicked softly on the wood. Luke was halfway up the ladder when he heard it, a faint sound, deep in the back corner of the barn. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. More like the soft scuff of movement. He froze, Rusty did too. Luke climbed down slowly and reached for the small flashlight on his belt. The beam swept across hay bales, tools, and old wheelbarrow, nothing unusual. But then, there it was again, a faint whimper. Rusty, stay. Rusty didn't. He bolted ahead, nose low, tail stiff. Luke followed, heart ticking faster, and then saw what had made the sound. Behind a stack of hay, half hidden beneath an old tarp, was a small crate. The wood was warped, the hinges rusted. Rusty pawed at it, whining. "Easy, boy," Luke murmured, crouching down. He tugged the tarp away and pulled the crate forward. It was heavier than it looked. When he pried it open, the smell hit first: old straw, rust, and something faintly animal. Inside were bones. Small ones. Collar. Luke sat back, stunned. The collar still had a tag, worn but readable. "Daisy." Rusty whined again, paw resting on the edge of the crate. "Was she yours?" Luke whispered. He didn't know why he said it, but it felt right. Rusty looked at him, eyes deep and sad. The image hit Luke like a punch. The thought of Rusty as a younger dog, locked in the same barn, hearing his friend cry, unable to help. Maybe that's why he'd been afraid of this place. Maybe this barn reminded him of all the things he couldn't save. Luke ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "I'm sorry, buddy. You didn't deserve that." He carried the crate out into the cold afternoon. Rusty followed close behind, silent now. Together, they dug a small hole by the edge of the field where the snow lay thin and soft. Luke placed the bones gently inside, then covered them with earth. When he was done, he stood there for a long moment, breath visible in the air. "Rest easy, Daisy," he said quietly. "He made it out. He's safe now." Rusty pressed his head against Luke's leg, and for a moment, neither of them moved. That night, something shifted between them. Rusty didn't sleep by the door or under the bed. He jumped up beside Luke for the first time, curling into the space near his feet. Luke pretended to mind at first, but he didn't move him. In the dark, Luke thought about Daisy, about Greyridge, about how Rusty had survived, even when no one came for him. It reminded him of his own homecoming, the one that never felt like one. He'd always thought of war as a place you leave behind. But sitting there, listening to Rusty's steady breathing, he realized something. War wasn't a place. It was a weight. You carried it until you found something strong enough to share it with. Over the next few days, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the farm. Little things, the faint crunch of snow outside at night, the mailbox left open, the gate swinging when it shouldn't. He brushed it off at first, but Rusty didn't. The dog had gone back to sleeping near the door, ears twitching at every sound. One night, Luke woke to Rusty growling low in his throat. The kind of growl that comes from deep instinct, not anger but warning. "Rusty!" The dog was at the window, fur bristled. Luke reached for the flashlight and crossed the room quietly. There, near the barn, he saw it, a flicker of light, the brief reflection of metal or glass, gone as soon as it appeared. Luke's pulse quickened. He turned off the flashlight, stood in the dark, and listened. Nothing, just the wind. Rusty stayed alert long after that, eyes fixed on the window. The next morning, Luke found fresh footprints again near the barn, and not his own. He knelt, brushing snow aside. The prints led toward the woods. "Someone's been here," he muttered. Rusty sniffed the trail and barked once. Sharp, certain. Luke felt that old, familiar tension coil in his gut, the same readiness that had kept him alive overseas. But he wasn't that man anymore. This wasn't a war zone. And yet, the instinct didn't fade. He decided to set up a camera by the barn, an old motion sensor one he used to monitor coyotes. If someone was coming around, he'd know. That night, as the wind howled outside, Luke sat by the fire, Rusty's head resting on his knee. "Guess we'll find out who's been sneaking around," he said softly. Rusty thumped his tail once, then closed his eyes. Luke stared into the fire for a long time, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. There were two wars still being fought on that farm, one in the man, one in the dog. And both were about to find out that healing wasn't just about surviving the past. It was about facing what still haunted it. The wind had teeth that morning. It tore across the fields, bending the tall, frozen grass and rattling the loose boards on the barn. Luke pulled his jacket tighter and stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hands. Rusty was already out there, nose to the air, tail low. He hadn't barked yet, but his stillness said enough. Luke followed his gaze toward the woods. The snow there was thick and untouched, except for a narrow line of prints cutting through the white. They weren't animal tracks this time. They were boots. He set down his coffee, heart starting to pound with that old, familiar rhythm. Slow, deliberate, ready. He slipped on his gloves and grabbed the old rifle that leaned by the door. Not because he meant to use it, but because holding it made him feel steady. "Stay close," he told Rusty. The dog fell in beside him as they crossed the yard, the only sound the crunch of snow under their boots. The prints led past the barn,